Greetings, guys. This video I'm gonna do a response to Barry Isaac's tag of me in the group there when it comes to the Last Judgment. You're gonna have to bear with me as it's 4:45 in the morning and I only had maybe 2 hours sleep. But I'm gonna entitle this video "The Last Judgment in Matthew in AD 70, 13 passages exegeted." So we should probably get right to it. Our first passage is going to be Matthew chapter 3 and following, and speaking of John the Baptist. John comes on the scene and says, "The kingdom of heaven has drawn near. It's at hand. It's at hand's length. It has drawn near." He chastises the Pharisees and scribes and speaks of a harvest of wrath. A harvest of wrath. And in this harvest of wrath, we see clearly it is AD 70. All agree Matthew 3 is speaking of AD 70 when he speaks of that harvest and that harvest of wrath. And he's getting that idea, that understanding of the harvest of wrath from the prophets. We see in Isaiah 17 and 18 the judgment of Damascus, Syria, by the Assyrians. It's a harvest of wrath. We see in Isaiah 51 when the Babylonians, the Neo-Babylonians, would come in and take Judah from 605 to 586, those captivities in the final siege. That's a harvest of wrath. We see in Jeremiah 25 the judgment of Babylon would be a harvest of wrath. And so when we get to the New Testament, John acting like an Old Testament prophet, and we'll see Jesus who acts like an Old Testament prophet, as N.T. Wright and other scholars acknowledge. He's an oratory prophet, traveling prophet, Christ, but they're using that same motif from the prophets. And yet in the New Testament it gets a little different. It's not only a harvest of wrath, but then the remnant. It's not a nation being destroyed only, Jerusalem, but it speaks of the remnant as well, and we see that in John, that there will be the chaff, and then there will be the wheat. And this, of course, is the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Yet it's the time of the harvest. Let me see here. Verse 7. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming for baptism, he said, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come?" Matthew 3:7, or the coming wrath, and that's only used 2 other times in the New Testament. In 1 Thessalonians 1:10, when Paul says Jesus is come for salvation, that is, and not for wrath, that is the coming wrath. And 1 Thessalonians 2:16, wrath has come upon them to the complete end. That's the Jews, AD 70. It is the coming wrath. So in Matthew 3:7, in 1 Thessalonians 2:16, both all agree across the board as AD 70 is the coming wrath. And yet it's used again in 2 Thessalonians 1:10, a chapter earlier than 1 Thessalonians 2, which also speaks of wrath, orge, and yet we're to believe they're 2 different events, speaks of the coming wrath. So he speaks of the coming wrath. All agree this is AD 70. He says those who do not bear fruit to repentance would experience this wrath. The axe is already laid at the root of the trees. Therefore every tree that does not bear good fruit is cast down and thrown into the fire. Verse 12, his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will thoroughly clear his threshing floor, and he will gather his wheat into the barn, but he will burn the chaff with unquenchable fire. Well, what's that unquenchable fire in the Gospels? And we see weeping and gnashing of teeth and things like this. It's tied into Gehenna a lot of the times. This is Gehenna, the wrath of God in Paul, and the lake of fire in Revelation. But here we see a judgment, and it's a judgment of wrath that would fall in AD 70, but the remnant would be gathered into the barn. This is the completion of the second Exodus, the regathering, the eschatological regathering of the remnant. Matthew chapter 7, verse 15 through 21 is our second passage. Matthew 7, 15 through 21. I'm not going to read it all, but he speaks of beware of the false prophets. Matthew 7, 15. Who would the false prophets be in Matthew? Wouldn't it be the Pharisees and scribes? Beware of the false prophets. When they come to you, that's his audience. He's speaking of the Pharisees and scribes, the lawyers and the Pharisees. In sheep's clothing, but are inwardly ravenous wolves. And he gives the same motif as John in Matthew chapter 3. Every good tree that bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a good tree produce bad fruit, so on and so forth. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So this is in context of the false prophets, of the Pharisees and scribes, and this is identical to Matthew chapter 3, which is AD 70. All would agree, all commentators would agree, no matter what their eschatological position is, that John in Matthew 3 is speaking of the fall of Jerusalem. And yet Jesus here speaks very clearly of the false prophets, brought of vipers, Pharisees and scribes of Matthew 3, and he speaks of fruit and being cast down, trees being cast down. That's Matthew 3 as well. Our third passage is Matthew chapter 8, and we're going to spend a little time here. Matthew chapter 8, verse 11 and 12. Matthew chapter 8, verse 11 and 12. I'll get the context here. And when Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, imploring him, and saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion said, Lord, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof, but you say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes. And to another, come, and he comes. And to my slave, do this, and he does it. Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to all who were following, truly I say to you, I have not found such faith with anyone in Israel. I say to you, that many will come from the east and west and recline at the table with the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now verse 11, I say to you that many will come in the east and the west and recline at the table. This is from Isaiah, pretty much. The Isaiah passages. Isaiah chapter 11, you will gather from the north, from the south, from the east to the west. Isaiah 43, give them up from the south, so on and so forth. This is the regathering of the remnant into the land. This is the second Exodus, the consummation of the second Exodus. There's no doubt about that. And of course, it's Isaiah chapter 49, my favorite passage in Isaiah. It is the regathering of Israel into Zion. And yet it's the time of the banquet, the marriage banquet. The marriage banquet in Isaiah is Isaiah chapter 25, 6 through 9, where we see the marriage banquet and where we see Zion restored and we see the second Exodus. Well, what do we see here in Matthew chapter 8, verse 11? We see the second Exodus, the regathering, including the Gentiles. That's the whole point of the centurion. The Gentiles are gathered in as well. Isaiah chapter 11, 10 through 12, and many other places in Isaiah. So the remnant of Israel and the Gentiles would be gathered at the banquet with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would have to be raised up. They would have to be resurrected to take place of this banquet in kingdom. And yet this is Hebrews chapter 11. That he never received the promise, Abraham. He was still looking for a heavenly country, and yet he would receive a better resurrection. Isaiah chapter 25, at the time of the marriage banquet, and the second Exodus, we have the resurrection. But the sons of the kingdom, who are the sons of the kingdom? That's Israel. Covenantal term, sons. Will be cast out into outer darkness. Sounds like a passage we just read that referred to AD 70. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, what's the place of outer darkness and weeping and gnashing of teeth in the Synoptic Gospels? In the teachings of Christ. That's Gehenna. That's Gehenna. That's hell. That's the lake of fire. And there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And we go to Matthew chapter 21, we see clearly when the sons of the kingdom are cast out. All agree Matthew 21 is AD 70, the wicked husbandmen, and how they would be judged for killing the prophets, killing Jesus the Son, and killing the apostles and prophets. And yet the sons of the kingdom are cast out at that time as well. And we see in Matthew 22, and we're going to get to this in a minute, Matthew 21 and 22. But the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot, throw him into outer darkness, and there will be a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, obviously Jesus doesn't believe in two different places of weeping and gnashing of teeth in outer darkness. And yet Matthew 22 is the marriage, which would take place at the burning of the great city. And yet the marriage was already prepared, verse 3 and 4. A lot have been trying to tell me lately that no, there's a gap between verse 7 and 8 in Matthew 22. That the invitation goes out after the destruction of Jerusalem, so there's a mysterious 2,000-year gap. No, before the invitations went out, before the city was even burnt, the wedding was ready. Matthew chapter 3 verse 4 and chapter 8. But we'll get to that in a bit. Matthew chapter 11 verse 20 through 24 is our fourth passage. Then he began to denounce the cities in which most of the miracles were done because they did not repent. Woe to you, Chesarin, it's early. Woe to you, Bethsaida, for if miracles had occurred in Tyre and Sidon, which occurred in you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Nevertheless, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, will not be exalted to heaven, but you will descend to Hades. If the miracles had occurred in Sodom, which occurred in you, it would have remained to this day. Nevertheless, I say to you that it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than you. The day of judgment. Now, he speaks of Capernaum in Galilee. Galilee was destroyed also, obviously, in the destruction of Jerusalem. I think it was one of the first places to go after the revolt in 66, or maybe later in 67. But Jesus makes it very clear that in the judgment, it'll be more tolerable for these nations than for you. That's his audience. That's his audience. It'll be more tolerable than for you in the judgment of these cities, of these other cities of the Near East, way back when. Sodom, Gomorrah, Tyre, Sidon. It'll be more tolerable for them for Sodom in the day of judgment than for you. That's his contemporary generation. And what is this? This is resurrection. They would have to be raised, wouldn't they? The people of Tyre and Sidon. Sodom, wouldn't they have to be raised? This is resurrection. And yet, this is the judgment of that generation. And we're going to get to Matthew 12. He makes it even more explicit. So here, he says, in the judgment of AD 70 would be the judgment of Tyre, Sidon, Bethsaida, so on and so forth. And obviously they would have to be raised up. This is the resurrection. Passage number 5 is Matthew chapter 12, 38 through 42. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees said to him, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. But he answered and said to them, An evil and adulterous generation craves for a sign, yet no sign will be given to you but the sign of Jonah the prophet. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monsters, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation, and all agree across the board that this generation in the synoptics always means that contemporary generation. All agree with that. All agree with that. Except the dispensationalists, when they get to Matthew 24, they say, yeah, every other text, but not Matthew 24, 34, Luke 21, 30, 32, or Mark 13. Where was I? The men of Nineveh, capital of Assyria, which is long gone, will stand up with this generation at the judgment, and will condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up in the generation, with this generation at the judgment, and will condemn it, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, something greater than Solomon is here. You notice how we have a non-Israelite people being looked upon as saved compared to that generation. The Satirian man had great faith, and yet truly, which is an emphatic statement, a strong statement, truly, I have not seen such faith in all of Israel. And yet we're seeing these Gentile nations being rewarded over that generation. So Matthew chapter 12, 38 through 42, very clearly, this generation. And he actually says the queen of the south will rise up with this generation. Of course she has to rise up. Of course they would have to rise up. Of course the Assyria, Nineveh would have to rise up. This is resurrection again with the judgment in this generation. Unbelievable. Overlooked passages, Matthew 11 and 12. Very overlooked. Now to our sixth passage, Matthew 13, 24 through 30. And I'm not going to read all this. We're all familiar with this. This is the explanation part of the parable of the wheat and the tares. But this is identical to Matthew chapter 3. There should be no denying that. This is identical with the chaff and the wheat of the harvest of John, which all agree is 80-70. Yet Jesus is saying the exact same thing. First gather up the tares and bind them in a bundle to burn them, but gather the wheat into the barn. That's Matthew 3:12. And yet this harvest motif we see in the New Testament, Matthew 3, Matthew 13, Revelation 14, is taken from the Old Testament. It's taken from Isaiah chapter 51 at the judgment of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, of Jerusalem by the Neo-Babylonians. Jeremiah 25, the judgment of the Babylonians. Isaiah 17, the judgment of Damascus and Syria, or Syria in Damascus. And so in the prophets, a harvest was a harvest of a nation to wrath. And yet in the New Testament, it is Jerusalem that is the nation of wrath. But yet this is the time of the remnant too, you see. That's why we have a difference from here to the prophets. The prophets, there's no gathering of any type of remnant. But here there is, because the eschatological remnant, the time was ready. Now to number 7 here, Matthew 16:24 through 28. Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. But whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit if a man gains the whole world and forfeit his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come, or about to come, in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will repay every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Now he speaks here about his death. He speaks about them picking up their cross, their persecution. Then he speaks about him coming in the glory of the Father, which R.T. France, and I'm trying to think of the other, who would it be? It might be Robert Gundry as well, has said that Matthew 16:27, coming in the glory of the Father, is coming as he did Yahweh in the Old Testament. Those national judgments, the coming in the same manner, in like manner. R.T. France, and it's another scholar, I don't know if it's Gundry, I can't remember off the bat right now. So he will come with his angels, and they will repay every man according to his deeds. Well, look at Romans chapter 2, and the language Paul uses when he speaks of the judgment. When he speaks of the judgment, he speaks of glory. Look at Romans 2, 5 through 10. And he says he will repay every man according to his deeds. Paul is drawn from Matthew chapter 16. And in 2 Timothy 4:1, when Paul says Jesus is going to come in the kingdom, he's about to come in his kingdom, in the judgment. He is drawn from Matthew 16, verse 27. The judgment in the kingdom. And in 2 Timothy 4:1, he says he is about to come. Jesus says some standing here will not taste death. Kingdom, kingdom. Judgment, judgment, coming, coming. Paul is drawn from Matthew. Even if you want to argue Matthew was written later than AD 70, still we have the tradition going back very, very early. Now to our 8th passage, Matthew 21:33 through 44. I'm not going to read all this. I'm going to try to save time here, guys, and just not read all these passages, but just go over them. The landowner. And this has the harvest as well. When the harvest time approached, he sent his slaves to the vine growers to receive his produce. So this is the harvest of Matthew 13. Of Matthew chapter 3. And we've already established our harvest of Matthew chapter 3 being AD 70. There's no doubt about that. There's no debate across the board. Everyone would agree with that, Matthew 3. But Matthew 3 is a springboard for the harvest in the New Testament, for Matthew 13 and here in Matthew 21. And all commentators agree across the board that Matthew 21:33 through 43, this parable, is speaking of the coming in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. The landowner, being the father, sends his servants to gather the fruit, but they were treated spitefully, Then the son was sent. He was killed. Then more servants were sent, the apostles and prophets. They were killed. And so what happens, therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those wicked, or to those vine growers? They said to him, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end, and will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers, who will repay him the produce at the proper seasons. And so, since this is the time of the kingdom, which is the time of the judgment, Matthew chapter 16, with Matthew chapter 3, the kingdom has drawn near, yet it's the time of the judgment of the harvest. Since this is the time of the kingdom, and yet it's fulfilled in AD 70, the coming in AD 70, verse 40, it would be the time of the judgment. Matthew 22, 1 through 14, our 9th passage. We have 14 passages. I thought we had 13. Matthew 22, again, the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom, judgment. Like we just seen in Matthew 16. Kingdom, judgment. And we see here it's a reiteration of Matthew 21, the wicked husbandman. It's the same idea, but it's the marriage feast. They spurned the invitation. They killed the son. But the king was enraged and sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. Again, all agree this is AD 70, all commentators. I'm not making this up. And so the marriage would happen at the burning of the city. But some people now, I've been in dialogue with them and trying to put a 2,000-year gap in here. They say, then he said to his slaves, the wedding is ready. Yeah, then. And they try to make this after AD 70. Well, let's go up to verse 3. And he sent out his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast, and they were unwilling to come. The wedding was already ready. You don't invite people to a wedding feast if it's not prepared. Verse 4, again he sent out other slaves, saying, tell those who have been invited, Israel, behold, I've prepared my dinner, my oxen, my fatted livestock, and all butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding. It was all ready before the city was burnt. So there's no mysterious 2,000-year gap in Matthew chapter 22, because people see the train coming when you point out, well, Matthew 22 has a coming, has a kingdom, has a marriage, and has a burning of Jerusalem. Revelation 19, you have the coming of the Lord, at the kingdom, the marriage, at the burning of the great city. So they see the train coming and they get desperate. What's our next text? Matthew 23, verse 34 through 36. This would be number 10, I believe, on the list, and we're almost done. Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your cities and in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. This is the judgment. It's not only vindication, but this is the judgment, going back to creation. And I don't see why it would not be the judgment, going back to creation. It's not just vindication of the martyrs, but it's the general judgment as well, I believe. As verse 39, he mentions the coming of the Lord. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. From Psalm 118, Psalm 113 to 18, I think they read it. It was the Feast of Passover, Tabernacles, I forget. But what's our next text? Matthew 24, 31. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, this is Isaiah chapter 27, verse 9, the sounding of the great trumpet. Yet Isaiah chapter 24 through 27 is one section within Isaiah. Isaiah's apocalypse, the apocalypse of Isaiah, it's one section, and yet Isaiah 24 through 27 is the end of everything. It's the judgment of mankind, it's the resurrection, so on and so forth. And yet he's drawn from there, and not only that, we have this gathering again, this gathering motif of Matthew 21, the gathering of the fruit, the gathering motif of Matthew 13, the wheat and the tares, the gathering motif of Matthew chapter 3 in John the Baptist, which everyone says spoke of AD 70. And so Matthew 24:31 would be the time of the judgment as well. The time of the gathering of the elect would be the time of the judgment, as we've seen in the other passages, Matthew 16 especially. Our next passage, number 12, is 42 through 51 of the same chapter. I'm not going to read it all here, but he's talking about him coming as a thief and being ready. And of course, Paul borrows from this because he borrows from Matthew 24 through 25 throughout 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. We see this 1 Thessalonians 4. What's that? Well, that's Matthew 24 verse 31. Well, this here is 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, him coming as a thief. And he comes as a thief, verse 50, the master of the slave will come in a day when he does not expect him, at an hour which he does not know, and he will cut him in pieces and assign him in a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We've already seen in Matthew chapter 8, the weeping and gnashing of teeth is at the time of the marriage banquet, the kingdom, and the regathering, which is AD 70. We see in Matthew 22, verse 13, weeping, gnashing of teeth is AD 70, the marriage banquet there at the time of the burning of the city. Our next passage is going to be Matthew 25, 31 through 46. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all his angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. That's Matthew 16:27. Anyone that wants to doubt that, they can doubt it. Glorious throne's not used there, but do the exact same words have to be used in every text for them not to be parallel passages? So this is Matthew 16:27, which is AD 70. All the nations will be gathered before him. Let me see here, verse 34. Then the king will say, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." This is the time of the kingdom. Yet, in Matthew, contextually, when is the time of the kingdom according to Jesus? In Matthew 21 and 22, and in Matthew 16, 27 and 28. It's AD 70. It's AD 70. Matthew 25:31 is AD 70. Is Matthew 16:27, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him. Then we see the time of the kingdom. There's no doubt about this, that this is AD 70. And yet, what we see here, I believe, is those that mistreated the disciples. It's the judgment of the nations, and yet Matthew chapter 24, 7 and following, or 14 and in 7, in verse 9, we see the nations. Okay, the gospel is to go out to all nations. This is the treatment, as J.S. Russell pointed out in his amazing work, The Parousia. This is the treatment of the disciples of preaching the gospel to the nations that rejected them and their message. This is what this is. And of course, contextually, we see clearly with verse 31 being Matthew 16:27, the time of the kingdom, Matthew 16 again, verse 28, Matthew 21, Matthew 22 would be AD 70, this judgment. It's the nations that rejected the gospel. And this is what we see in Matthew chapter 24. We see the nations being mentioned a couple times. There are these different nations. I don't believe there's a split here. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. In various places there will be famines and earthquakes. So these are the nations. It's not the tribes of Israel, as some try to say. Many will fall away, betray one another, so on and so forth. This gospel will be preached. This gospel of the kingdom will be preached to all the world as a testimony to the nations. Then the end will come, the end of the aeon. So the gospel went out. These are the nations that rejected the gospel. And also Matthew 25 is the time of the wedding. Yet we've already seen in Matthew 22, 1 through 14, the time of the wedding is at the time of the burning of the city that rejected the servants and killed Christ. AD 70. So I have no problem. And of course, verse 46, these will go into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. This is the same as Jesus in Matthew 8, Matthew 22, and other places, speaking of outer darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth. Gehenna in other passages. It's all in the same. So we see 4 parallels, I believe, in Matthew 25 that go back to Matthew, other passages we already examined. And our last passage, which I believe is number 14, I thought we had 13, but I think this is 14, is Matthew 26, verse 64. This isn't even a proper trial by law, by Torah, of course, but I'm just going to read verse 64. Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." And this is parallel to Revelation 1:7. Then the high priest tore his robes. He knew he was calling himself Yahweh. I mean, all sort of agree on that. And that's definitely what we have here. He's calling himself Yahweh. He's going to come. They're going to see him sitting at the right hand of power and glory. And he's alluding to Daniel chapter 7. And so they know Daniel 7, the Sanhedrin there. They know what Daniel 7's all about. And so Matthew 26:64 I believe is a clear indication of that. Yeah, hey, hereafter you will see the Son of Man come in power and great glory. Well, that's Matthew 24:30. The Son of Man will come in power and great glory. And yet this would take place in that generation. That's our 14 passages, guys. We got through it. God bless. Have a good one. And make sure you keep studying. Keep studying. Keep studying. Keep studying.